9,000 years is a long time to wait. In July 1996, two young men wading into the Columbia River near Kennewick, Washington, spot something pale beneath the surface. A rock, they assume, until it isn't. It's a human skull. Divers soon pull up nearly an entire skeleton, buried in river mud since before the pyramids. But the first expert to examine the face says something that sparks a legal war lasting 2 decades. This skull does not look Native American. The crowd noise from the boat races is still carrying across the water when the county coroner's office gets the call. What starts as a routine recovery, human bones near a riverbank, not unusual in a region with a long history of settlement and burial, quickly turns into something else entirely. The bones come out of the riverbank in pieces, damp and heavy with silt, laid out on a table under fluorescent light. There are roughly 350 fragments in total. A skull, a jaw, vertebrae, long bones stained the colour of old tea, a pelvis, ribs cracked thin as pottery shards. A stone projectile point is even found embedded in the hip, an old injury the man apparently survived and carried with him for years, the bone healed and remodelled around it. It will later turn out to have nothing to do with dating the skeleton, but at the time it adds to the sense that this is not an ordinary find, that whoever this was lived a long, eventful life before ending up beneath this riverbank. The first radiocarbon estimate comes back at around 8,500 years old. That number alone should have settled the significance of the case immediately. In American archaeology, a skeleton that age is rare enough to be a national event. It predates the pyramids of Egypt, predates writing, predates almost everything most people picture when they hear the word history. Only a handful of skeletons this complete, this old, and this well-preserved had ever been recovered anywhere in North America. Under different circumstances, this alone would have made headlines as a straightforward scientific triumph, a rare, direct window into people who lived on this continent while glaciers still covered much of the northern hemisphere. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why we make these videos. Let us know where you are right now and what time it is. I always check the comments and I find something almost impossibly moving about seeing them accumulate. Someone in Texas at midnight, someone in Sydney at sunrise, someone in a car outside a town whose name they have to look up to spell correctly. All of us gathered in the dark around the same questions about people who vanished before they could introduce themselves. Leave a comment if you feel like it. And if this kind of long, slow, careful history is something you want more of, the subscribe button, the accepted story. Before this find was simple enough to fit in a sentence. Ancient people crossed from Asia into the Americas, most likely by way of the Bering Land Bridge, and their descendants became the many indigenous nations of North and South America. If that story held together the way most people assumed it did, then an 8,500-year-old skeleton pulled from a river in the Pacific Northwest should, in its basic proportions, resemble the ancestors of the people who live there today. That assumption sat quietly underneath the entire discovery. Nobody had to say it out loud, because nobody expected it to be tested this directly, this soon, on a body this old and this complete. Then forensic anthropologist James Chatters takes his own look at the skull, and the quiet assumption starts to come apart. He records a long, narrow brain case, a projecting midface, described in his early notes as almost delicate compared to typical Native American crania, a jaw with a chin that reads, to his eye, as more pronounced than expected. This is standard forensic method, the same measurements used every day to help identify unknown remains in ordinary criminal cases, applied here to bones with no missing persons file, no dental records, no photograph to compare against. In his early assessment, he reaches for a comparison that will follow this skeleton for the rest of its public life. He describes the features as Caucasoid-like, language borrowed from an older, cruder system of racial classification still used in some forensic training at the time, but language that lands in 1996 like a small bomb. Word spreads fast that the ancient man from the river might not be Native American at all. Some early reporting even raises the possibility that the remains could belong to an early European settler, an idea supported briefly by a stone tool initially mistaken for a piece of clothing hardware, until closer inspection and the radiocarbon date make an 18th or 19th century origin impossible almost as soon as the idea appears. Whatever this skeleton is, it is not recent. It is not a homesteader. It is something older than the label anyone is prepared to put on it, and considerably stranger than anyone expected on the day the bones came out of the water. Here is what matters, and what is easy to blur if the story moves too fast. This is one man's forensic opinion, built from measuring a skull with calipers and comparing the numbers to reference collections assembled from very different, much smaller sample sets, most gathered decades earlier under very different scientific standards. It is not a genetic test. It is not proof of ancestry. It is a visual and statistical judgment applied to a set of bones with no birth certificate, no living relative on record, and 8,500 years of silence behind them. But in the summer of 1996, that distinction does not slow anything down. The opinion is already public. The story is already moving faster than the science underneath it, picked up by wire services, repeated in newspapers from coast to coast, each retelling flattening the careful hedges of the original assessment into something closer to a headline fact. Because under federal law, a skeleton like this one cannot simply sit on a laboratory shelf while people debate its meaning. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, passed only a few years earlier in 1990, exists specifically to identify and return Native American human remains and burial objects to the tribes connected to them. The law came out of a long, uncomfortable history, decades in which indigenous remains had been collected, studied, and stored in museums and universities across the country, often without consent from any living descendant, often reduced to catalogue numbers in collections meant for research rather than remembrance. NAGPRA was built to correct that pattern going forward, requiring institutions to work with tribes to identify affiliated remains and return them for proper burial. 5 tribes and bands of the Columbia Basin, among them the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation, the Umatilla, the Yakima, the Nez Perce, and the Wanapum, assert exactly that connection almost immediately after the discovery becomes public. To them, this is not an unidentified specimen waiting on a diagnosis. It is an ancestor. Recovered from ancestral land along a river, their oral histories describe their people living beside since the beginning of memory. They request the remains be returned for reburial, precisely as the law allows, treating the request not as a legal maneuver, but as an obligation owed to someone found on their own land. But a skull that has just been described publicly as Caucasoid-like complicates that request in the eyes of federal officials and the courts. If the remains cannot be shown to be affiliated with a present-day Native American tribe, NAGPRA's repatriation requirement may not even apply to them. And so a discovery that began with 2 men standing in a river on a summer afternoon becomes, almost overnight, a jurisdictional knot. Scientists who want to study one of the oldest, most complete skeletons ever recovered in North America, and tribes who want their ancestor returned to the earth, both looking at the same set of bones and finding the law pointing them toward the same unresolved question. Does the shape of a face get to decide who owns 10,000 years of a place's story? Picture standing on that gravel bar the way it must have looked in the hour before any of this began, sun flattening the water, engine noise from the race crowd carrying down river, nothing in the air to suggest that a jawbone and a brow ridge were about to become the subject of a federal lawsuit. That is the strange part of a discovery like this one. It rarely announces itself as historic while it is happening. For a few hours it looks like nothing at all, just mud, just bone, just a curious shape under moving water, the kind of thing a person might walk past without a second look on any other summer afternoon. A group of scientists sues to block repatriation, arguing the remains are too scientifically significant and too ambiguous in stated origin to be reburied before further study is possible. The case moves into federal court, and it will stay there for years, unresolved, while the actual skeleton sits wrapped in acid-free tissue inside a climate-controlled storage room at the Burke Museum in Seattle. Skull shape becomes courtroom evidence. Cranial measurements become exhibits attached to legal filings. An 8,500-year-old man, found by accident on an ordinary summer day, becomes the subject of motions, appeals, and expert testimony stretching from the mid-1990s into the 2000s, with no side fully satisfied and no bones released to either side. And underneath all of it sits a question nobody in that courtroom can yet answer with real confidence. Is the shape of a skull actually a reliable signature of where someone's ancestors came from? Or is something else, something no one in 1996 has the tools to read yet, about to prove that the entire argument, however sincerely fought on both sides, was resting on the wrong kind of evidence? In the meantime, the skeleton itself becomes something almost unheard of in American archaeology, a set of remains famous before anyone agrees on who they belong to. Newspapers run illustrations of the reconstructed face. Documentary crews request access that is largely denied while litigation continues. Academic conferences host panel discussions built entirely around a single unresolved case, with researchers arguing methodology and law in equal measure, often in the same sentence. For the tribes watching this unfold from outside the courtroom, the spectacle carries its own particular weight, a very public argument over whether an ancestor found on their own land actually belongs to them, conducted almost entirely in a vocabulary of statistics, motions, and expert declarations that has little to do with the relationship they already understand the discovery to represent. For the scientists pushing to study the remains further, the stakes feel just as real, if differently framed. A skeleton this complete and this old offers an almost unrepeatable opportunity to understand health, diet, injury, and daily life among some of the earliest people ever to leave physical evidence of themselves in North America. Losing access to it, before that potential is even partly explored, feels to many researchers like losing a piece of the past that can never be recovered again. Both sides are, in their own terms, trying to protect something irreplaceable. Neither side, in 1996, has any way of knowing that the real answer is sitting inside the bones themselves, waiting on a kind of test that does not yet exist in any form capable of reading it. That question will not be settled by another expert opinion, another round of calipers against bone, another comparison chart of cranial measurements. It will take almost 20 years and a piece of technology barely usable on ancient remains in 1996, before the man from the river finally gets to answer, in his own preserved cells, who he really was, and before the very method used to keep him from his ancestors becomes the reason he has finally returned to them. A federal courtroom carries a different kind of silence than a riverbank. No water sound, no engine noise, just the low hum of ventilation and the shuffle of paper as lawyers move between file boxes, stacked higher than most of the people in the room. On one side sit attorneys representing a coalition of scientists who want continued access to the Kennewick skeleton for further study. On the other sit representatives of 5 tribes and bands of the Columbia Basin, arguing for something that predates any courtroom procedure by thousands of years: the right to bring an ancestor home. The law at the centre of the case, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, was passed in 1990 after decades of Native American human remains sitting in museum drawers and university collections, often without consent, often without any attempt at identification beyond a catalogue number. NACPRA was meant to close that chapter of American archaeology. It required institutions receiving federal funding to work with tribes to identify and return remains and funerary objects with a demonstrated cultural affiliation. For most cases brought under the statute, this process worked roughly as intended, resolving quietly through documentation and negotiation rather than litigation. Kennewick Man was different, because his age placed him at the far edge of what oral tradition, archaeology, and law had ever tried to connect across the same unbroken line, and because the initial cranial assessment had already introduced doubt before any formal identification process even began. The tribe's position rests on more than sentiment. Their oral histories describe continuous habitation of the Columbia Basin, reaching back to the beginning of their people's memory, with no account of migration into the region from somewhere else, no story of arriving from elsewhere to displace an earlier population. To them, an 8,500-year-old skeleton recovered from the riverbank is not an open question requiring further proof. It is a member of their community, found on their land, and the law exists specifically to bring him home rather than to keep him indefinitely under study. The opposing argument does not deny that the tribes believe this, and does not dispute the sincerity of that belief. It argues instead that belief is not the same as demonstrated affiliation under the specific wording of the statute, and that a skeleton this old, with cranial features initially described as unlike modern Native American populations, cannot automatically be assumed to fall under NACPRA's protection without further scientific study to establish that connection formally. Here is the problem with resting an entire legal outcome on that argument. It treats a preliminary skull measurement, taken by one forensic anthropologist under time pressure in 1996, as though it carries the same evidentiary weight as a genetic test, when in fact it carries something closer to an informed guess, however carefully made. Nobody in that courtroom in the early years of this case has genetic data to argue about. They are arguing about the shape of bone, and about how much weight bone shape alone should be given in a legal proceeding with this much at stake. Initial court rulings favour the scientists. A federal judge determines, based largely on the ambiguity of the cranial evidence, that a direct cultural affiliation between the remains and any modern tribe has not been established under the statute, and permits continued scientific study rather than repatriation. To the tribes, this ruling does not feel like careful legal reasoning weighing competing interests fairly. It feels like the reopening of an old wound, a familiar story in which Native American ancestors are treated as specimens first and relatives second, echoing exactly the pattern NAGPRA had been written to prevent. To the scientists granted access, the ruling feels like a necessary safeguard, protecting one of the most significant skeletal discoveries in North American archaeology from being reburied and permanently placed beyond the reach of research before its full scientific value can even be understood. Both sides are arguing in good faith. That is easy to lose sight of in a story built around conflict, but it matters here, and it is worth holding on to through the rest of this investigation. Tribal members are not fighting a straw man of cold-hearted scientists. Many of the researchers involved genuinely believe they are protecting irreplaceable evidence of humanity's deep past in North America. Evidence that once reburied can never be recovered or re-examined by any future generation of scientists. And the tribes are not making an emotional argument devoid of substance. They are pointing to an unbroken relationship with a landscape that the written records simply cannot see far enough back to verify one way or the other. A relationship measured in a kind of continuity that legal statutes are not always well equipped to weigh against forensic testimony. The case becomes less about who is right in some abstract sense, and more about what kind of evidence could possibly settle a question this old, this contested, and this consequential for the people involved on both sides. For years, that evidence does not exist in a usable form. Ancient dinar extraction technology in the late 1990s and early 2000s is nowhere near capable of reliably sequencing a genome from bone this degraded and this old. Every attempt at the time risks contaminating or destroying material that cannot be replaced, and most researchers in the field are understandably cautious about even proposing genetic testing on remains this significant and this legally contested. So the case grinds forward instead on affidavits, radiocarbon reports, and competing interpretations of skull shape, while the actual skeleton remains housed at the Burke Museum in Seattle, sealed away from both the laboratory bench that might eventually answer the underlying question and the ground the tribes believe it belongs in. Outside the courtroom, the case draws a level of national attention rarely seen for an archaeological dispute. Newspapers frame it as a clash between science and sovereignty. Op-eds argue both directions, some warning that Indigenous claims threaten to place politics above objective research, others warning that the case shows exactly why Native communities have historically distrusted institutional science when it comes to their own ancestors. Anthropological associations filed briefs on one side, tribal coalitions filed briefs on the other. The skeleton itself, still sealed in storage, becomes something closer to a symbol than a set of physical remains, carrying more public argument on its shoulders than any 9,000-year-old collection of bone was ever likely to bear quietly. Inside the scientific community, the case also exposes a quieter, more technical disagreement that rarely makes it into the newspaper coverage. Several biological anthropologists not directly involved in the litigation raised concerns even at the time about how much weight a single cranial assessment should be given in a legal proceeding with this much riding on the outcome. Skull shape, they point out, can be shaped by nutrition during childhood, by mechanical stress from chewing tough or processed foods, by small sample sizes in the reference collections used for comparison, and by ordinary statistical variation among individuals, not only by deep ancestral relationships stretching back thousands of years. That caution rarely reaches the public conversation with the same force as the original Caucasoid-like description, in part because a note of methodological caution is a far less compelling headline than a claim that a skeleton looks unexpectedly foreign. Picture sitting in the gallery of that courtroom, watching two entirely different frameworks for understanding the past try to occupy the same legal space at once. One framework treats the land and the ancestor as inseparable, a relationship measured in continuous generations rather than years, where the identity of a 9,000-year-old skeleton is not actually in doubt to begin with. The other framework treats the skeleton as a data point, a physical record whose meaning has to be extracted through method and measurement before any claim on it can be honoured, where identity is something to be proven rather than something already known. Neither framework is dishonest, and neither side in that gallery is acting in bad faith. They are simply built to answer different kinds of questions about what it means to know who someone was, and this case is forcing them to answer the same one, in the same room, under the same statute. The legal fight stretches on through appeal after appeal, moving from district court into the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, spanning changes in federal administration, spanning years long enough that some of the original tribal elders who first requested repatriation in 1996 do not live to see the case resolved one way or another. Eventually, in 2004, the courts rule that the scientific study can continue, a decision that leaves the tribes without the outcome they sought for 8 years and leaves researchers with ongoing access to remains still legally unresolved in cultural affiliation, a partial victory that satisfies neither side completely. But even as the ruling closes one door, it leaves another one open. Almost by accident, in a way nobody arguing the case in 2004 could have fully anticipated. Continued access means continued opportunity for new methods to be applied to the same bones down the line, methods that did not exist when this case first began nearly a decade earlier. Somewhere in a research proposal, in a conversation between geneticists who specialise in recovering DNA from remains once thought too old and too degraded to test reliably, an idea starts to take shape. What if the argument over Kennewick Man's ancestry did not actually need another skull measurement, another affidavit, another comparison chart? What if it needed something the courtroom, for all its years of argument, had never actually had access to in the first place, the genome itself, read directly rather than inferred from the outside shape of bone? That idea will not move quickly. It will take the right technology, still years away from being reliable enough for material this degraded, the right team willing to take on a case this politically and scientifically sensitive, and roughly a decade more before anyone can put it into practice with confidence. In the meantime, the skeleton remains exactly where it has been for years, catalogued and climate-controlled, a physical presence at the centre of an argument that, for now, still has to be conducted entirely without it speaking for itself. What makes this stretch of the story worth sitting with is not simply that it was long, or that it was contentious, but that everyone involved was, in a real sense, waiting on evidence that did not yet exist. Legal precedent can only be built from the tools available at the time, and in the late 1990s and early 2000s, those tools stopped at bone. The courtroom did the best it could with what it had, and what it had was, in the end, not enough. But once it does move forward, the eventual answer will not just resolve the question this courtroom spent years failing to settle through argument alone. It will reveal that the entire debate over what the skull looked like may have been asking the wrong kind of question from the very beginning, and that the real answer had been sitting inside the bones the whole time, waiting quietly for a method capable of finally reading it. A method that, when it finally arrives, will surprise almost everyone who spent those long years arguing on either side of the courtroom aisle, tribal members and scientists alike. In 1975, in the limestone hills near Lagoa Santa, Minas Gerais, a French-led archaeological team led by Annette Laming-Empereur, excavating the Lapa Vermelha Fafur rock shelter, uncovers a partial human skeleton. The remains belong to a young woman, roughly 20 to 25 years old at death, standing an estimated 1.5 meters tall, later given the name Luzia. Radiocarbon analysis eventually places her at approximately 11,500 years old, making her one of the oldest known human skeletons anywhere in the Americas, older even than the man from the Columbia River, and among the oldest well-preserved human remains found on either continent of the Western Hemisphere, predating the Kennewick discovery by roughly 3,000 years despite being unearthed more than 2 decades earlier. Her skull sits largely intact after more than 11,000 years underground, and when Brazilian anthropologist Walter Neves of the University of São Paulo examines it years later, he records a set of features that do not resemble the general expectation for ancient Native American crania. A narrow, elongated cranium. A projecting, forward-set face, low and prognathic. A broad nasal opening, low, rounded eye orbits. A pronounced chin, instead of the broader, shorter skull shape typically associated with Northeast Asian ancestry and modern indigenous American populations. Luzia's morphology reads in Neves's analysis as closer to Australo-Melanesian and Southeast Asian populations, along with certain African affinities noted by other researchers examining similar Lagoa Santa remains recovered from the same region over the following decades. This should stop you for a moment, because of what it means side by side with Kennewick Man. 2 of the oldest, most complete skeletons ever found in the Americas, one from the Pacific Northwest, one from the highlands of central Brazil, separated by roughly 6,000 miles and several thousand years. Both fail to resemble the modern indigenous populations who live in those same regions today. If this were only Kennewick Man, it could be dismissed as a single unusual individual, an outlier, a measurement artifact produced by an incomplete or damaged skull. Luzia makes it considerably harder to dismiss the pattern that easily. 2 continents, 2 ancient skulls, the same basic problem showing up independently in 2 places that had, as far as anyone could tell, no direct connection to each other at all. The old assumption being tested here is the same one from Chapter 1, just applied more broadly across the hemisphere. If the standard model holds, ancient Americans should share a general skeletal resemblance tracing back to a single Northeast Asian ancestral population that crossed into the continent via Beringia. Luzia's skull does not fit comfortably inside that model, at least not on its face, and neither do several of her contemporaries. Other early skeletons recovered from the same Lagoa Santa region over the following years, along with a set of remains later studied from Spirit Cave in Nevada, show broadly similar features, narrower, more projecting faces than expected. Described by multiple researchers as more reminiscent of populations from the Pacific Rim or Australasia than of the Native American populations living in the same places today. What began as a single unusual skeleton in Brazil grows over time into a documented pattern spanning multiple individuals and multiple sites. Neves does not stop at describing the anomaly. He builds a theory to explain it. His proposed model, sometimes called the Paleo-American hypothesis, suggests 2 separate waves of migration into the Americas rather than one. An earlier wave, carrying the Luzia-like morphology, arrives first, likely tracing back to an early Asian population with closer ties to the ancestors of Australo-Melanesian groups, and spreads across the continent over thousands of years. A later wave, ancestral to the vast majority of modern Native American populations, arrives afterward, carrying the more familiar Northeast Asian morphology, and over time either replaces or gradually absorbs the descendants of the first group through contact and interbreeding. It is an elegant explanation for an uncomfortable set of facts, offering a clean narrative that accounts for both the strange skulls and the modern populations that came after them, and for years it becomes one of the most influential frameworks in the field for interpreting the strange skulls of the earliest Americans. It is also, from the beginning, contested. Other anthropologists question whether cranial shape alone, without genetic confirmation, can really support a claim as large as a second separate migration event spanning an entire hemisphere. Skull shape can be influenced by diet, by mechanical stress during growth and development, by climate and altitude, by simple statistical noise in a small sample of ancient individuals, not only by deep ancestral relationships passed down across generations. Critics point out that a handful of skeletons, however carefully measured, may not be enough to support a conclusion this significant, particularly when the reference populations used for comparison are themselves limited in number and geographic spread. Drawn largely from 20th century collections that may not accurately represent the full range of variation present among ancient populations thousands of years earlier. Never's interpretation is taken seriously. It is published in respected journals. It shapes museum exhibits across Brazil and beyond. It becomes the working explanation cited in textbooks and documentaries for years. But it is never universally accepted within the field, and the disagreement over it will outlast Nevs's original papers by decades, resurfacing every time a new skeleton or a new dataset becomes available. Luzia's story does not end quietly in a research archive. Over the following decades, her skull becomes something close to a national symbol in Brazil, reproduced in textbooks, displayed as one of the most prized holdings of the National Museum in Rio de Janeiro, subject of documentaries and museum exhibits exploring the deep human history of South America. Researchers eventually used three-dimensional scanning and printing technology to create detailed replicas of her cranium, allowing continued study without further risk to the fragile original bone. That caution turns out to matter more than anyone could have predicted. In September 2018, a catastrophic fire tears through the National Museum in Rio de Janeiro, destroying an overwhelming majority of its nearly 20 million catalogued items, including the original Luzia skull and an earlier facial reconstruction built from it. What survives afterward is largely limited to prior scans, casts, and the data already extracted from her remains before the fire. A stark reminder of how fragile even the most significant physical evidence of the deep past can be, and how much scientific value can rest on documentation completed before disaster strikes, sometimes with little warning that it will ever be needed. Separately from the fire, and years before it, another thread of evidence had been developing alongside the skull debate, one worth noting here even though its role in this story does not fully resolve until later. Dental researcher Christy Turner had spent decades cataloguing tooth crown and root patterns across populations worldwide, identifying a cluster of traits he termed synodonty, common among Northeast Asian and Native American populations, and distinguishing it from sundodonty, a different dental pattern found across Southeast Asia. Turner's dental data broadly supported a Northeast Asian ancestral homeland for Native Americans, adding a separate line of physical evidence to the debate beyond skull shape alone. But dental analysis carries its own limitations, and this evidence too will eventually need to be revisited with more rigorous statistical methods, a detail this investigation returns to later, once the picture painted by Dina has had a chance to settle first. Picture crouching in that Brazilian cave the way the original excavation team must have, headlamp beams sweeping across damp limestone, cataloguing fragments of bone that had waited 11,500 years in the dark for someone to notice them. There is no drama in that moment itself, no dramatic music, just careful hands, small brushes clearing sediment away from bone, and a growing pile of numbered bags destined for a laboratory thousands of miles from where the excavation team first knelt in the dark. The drama comes later in that laboratory, and later still in the arguments that follow, the same essential pattern that played out on the Columbia River, replaying itself in a completely different hemisphere, under a different legal system, with no formal repatriation dispute attached, but with the same underlying questions sitting unresolved underneath it. By the early 2000s, the field is left holding two of its oldest, best-preserved skeletons, both apparently at odds with the population that supposedly descended from the same ancestral migration, and it has no clean way to resolve the contradiction using the tools available at the time. Skull shape has generated a theory, and the theory has generated a genuine, respectable scientific debate carried out in good faith across multiple continents. But skull shape has also generated real-world legal consequences, as seen in Kennewick Man's case. And nobody yet knows whether the physical evidence driving all of this can even be trusted the way it has been trusted for generations of comparative anthropology. If two of the oldest, most carefully studied skulls in the Americas do not resemble the populations who live there now, the field faces an uncomfortable choice, one with implications reaching far beyond a single research paper. Either the standard single migration story is wrong, and something more complicated happened during the earliest peopling of the continent, involving multiple distinct ancestral populations arriving at different times, or skull shape itself is not the reliable marker of ancestry that an entire body of comparative anthropology had assumed it to be for generations of research. Neither answer is small, neither can be settled comfortably from a museum drawer. And in the years immediately following Luzia's full analysis, nobody yet has the tools in hand to test which one is closer to the truth, leaving both explanations sitting side by side, unresolved, waiting for a technology that has not yet caught up to the question. Meanwhile, the two cases sit in an odd kind of parallel, without ever quite touching each other. Kennewick Man's dispute plays out in an American courtroom, driven by a specific legal statute and a specific set of tribal claimants. Luzia's case plays out in Brazilian academic circles and museum exhibitions, with no equivalent legal mechanism forcing a resolution one way or the other. Researchers studying one case are often only loosely aware of developments in the other, publishing in different journals, working in different institutional contexts, presenting at different conferences, and yet the underlying scientific question connecting them is identical. Can the shape of a skull, on its own, tell researchers where a population's ancestors actually came from, across a gap of many thousands of years? Until genetic sequencing technology matures enough to test ancient remains this degraded with confidence. That question remains open on two continents at once, argued by two largely separate scientific communities, each working from incomplete evidence toward the same eventual answer, without yet realizing how directly their two separate investigations were about to converge. That convergence does not happen inside a museum, and it does not happen inside a courtroom. It happens, for both skeletons, inside a genetics laboratory, once the technology finally catches up to a question that bone alone had never been equipped to answer on its own. A question that had, by this point, been sitting unresolved on two separate continents for the better part of 2 decades. Inside a museum reconstruction lab, a sculptor works under focused light, layering clay over a cast of Luzia's skull, building muscle depth and tissue thickness according to established forensic reconstruction methods. The same basic techniques used to help identify unknown crime victims applied here to a woman who died more than 11,000 years ago. The face that emerges under careful hands does not resemble the faces typically used to represent Native American ancestry in textbooks or museum displays. It looks, to many observers, more like a reconstruction of an early Australian or Melanesian individual, with a broad nose, a strongly projecting jaw, and deep-set eyes. The finished bust becomes a public sensation in Brazil, displayed prominently in the National Museum in Rio de Janeiro, reproduced in newspapers, discussed on television, a striking, tangible image standing in for an entire scientific controversy that most viewers will never read the underlying papers on, let alone weigh the statistical caveats buried inside them. This is where the story stops being one anomaly and starts becoming a genuine competition of explanations. Neves's two-wave Paleo-American model is one attempt to account for skulls like Luzia's and Kennewick Man's. It is not the only one circulating at the time. Separately and largely disconnected from the Paleo-American debate taking place in Brazilian academic circles, a small but vocal group of researchers has been promoting what is known as the Solutrean hypothesis. The idea that the technology behind Clovis stone tools, one of the signature toolkits of the earliest well-documented Americans, might trace back not to Northeast Asia, but to Ice Age Europe, carried across the North Atlantic by seafaring populations associated with the Solutrean culture of what is now France and Spain, following the edge of Atlantic pack ice westward during the last glacial maximum. The Solutrean hypothesis draws on real similarities in flint knapping technique between certain European Ice Age tools and Clovis points, particularly the distinctive overshot flaking method used to thin and shape both traditions of stone blades. Its proponents have pointed to the unexpected morphology of skeletons like Kennewick Man as circumstantial support. If some early American skulls looked less like classic Northeast Asian populations and more like something else entirely, the argument goes, perhaps the something else includes an unexpected European contribution to the earliest American gene pool, one erased from later populations but still faintly visible in a handful of exceptionally old skeletons. Here is where caution has to be stated plainly, because this is exactly the kind of claim that a documentary can either handle responsibly or turn into something closer to fringe entertainment. The Solutrean hypothesis has never been accepted by the majority of archaeologists and geneticists working on the peopling of the Americas. It remains a minority position, criticised for relying on surface-level tool similarities without adequate genetic or archaeological support, for the enormous logistical difficulty of an Ice Age transatlantic crossing along pack ice with no confirmed intermediate sites, and for underestimating how frequently similar flint knapping solutions can emerge independently among unrelated populations, solving the same physical problem with the same available raw materials. It is included here not because it is likely to be correct, but because it existed, publicly, as one of several competing attempts to explain the same underlying puzzle, the strange morphology of the earliest known Americans and the technological puzzle of Clovis toolmaking itself. The reconstructed face of Luzia and the widely circulated forensic sketches produced of Kennewick Man around the same period do something that raw skull measurements alone never could. They turn an abstract scientific debate into something the general public can look at directly and form an opinion about. A measurement chart comparing cranial indices means little to most people outside the field. A face, even a reconstructed one built from clay and calipers, means something immediately, emotionally, and often incorrectly. Museum visitors in Rio de Janeiro and newspaper readers in the United States alike come away from these images with a strong, intuitive sense of what these ancient people looked like, and, by extension, where they must have come from, an intuition built on artistic reconstruction rather than genetic evidence, but one that proves remarkably difficult to dislodge once it takes hold in the public imagination. This matters for how the Solutrean hypothesis manages to gain the traction it does. Despite remaining a minority position within serious archaeology, popular science books and documentary programs drawn to a dramatic story of Ice Age transatlantic contact sometimes present the idea with far more confidence than the underlying evidence supports, treating the unusual morphology of a handful of skeletons as though it were settled proof of European ancestry rather than one contested interpretation among several. Responsible researchers publishing rebuttals to the Solutrean hypothesis frequently find themselves competing against a much more compelling cinematic narrative, one built around bold sea voyages and hidden origins, rather than the more mundane, if ultimately more accurate, explanation of independent technological invention arrived at separately by unrelated populations solving the same practical problem. So by the early 2000s, the field finds itself holding at least 3 incompatible stories at once, each with its own community of supporters and its own body of supporting evidence, however contested. The traditional single migration model, strained but not disproven, still assumes one ancestral population moving from Northeast Asia into an empty continent, spreading gradually southward over thousands of years. Neves's two-wave Paleo-American model proposes an earlier distinct population later joined or replaced by the ancestors of modern Native Americans, based primarily on cranial morphology across multiple sites, and the Solutrean hypothesis, sitting at the margins of respectability within the broader field, proposes an entirely different geographic origin altogether, built on tool typology rather than bone or blood, and largely dismissed by the mainstream archaeological community even as it continues to attract public attention through popular books and documentaries. What all three theories share is the same underlying weakness, however differently they are regarded within the field. Every one of them is built primarily on physical shape, the shape of a skull, the shape of a stone tool, interpreted through comparison to reference populations and reference toolkits assembled from limited, unevenly distributed samples. None of them, at this point in the story, is built on a single sequenced genome from any of the individuals actually being argued about. The debate has been running for years on the evidence available before genetic testing on remains this old became reliable, and every side of it is essentially reading the same limited kind of signal and coming to strikingly different conclusions about what that signal actually means. Picture watching that reconstructed face take shape under the sculptor's hands, clay filling in over cheekbone and brow, becoming something disarmingly human and specific. A stranger's face assembled from 11,000-year-old fragments under studio lighting, designed to make the final result feel almost alive. It is easy to feel, watching a face resolve like that, as though you are looking at an answer, something settled and concrete. You are not. You are looking at one careful, technically skilled interpretation of bone shape, rendered convincingly enough to feel like certainty, in a field still years away from having the tool that could actually test whether that certainty is deserved, or whether the face in front of you is telling a story the genome underneath it would flatly contradict. That tool already exists elsewhere in science by this point. DNA sequencing has been transforming fields from criminal forensics to evolutionary biology for years, resolving paternity disputes and identifying disease causing mutations with a level of confidence skeletal analysis alone could never match. But applying it successfully to a set of remains this old, this degraded, and in some cases this legally and politically sensitive is a different problem entirely, requiring specialized laboratory protocols simply to avoid destroying what little genetic material survives. Contamination from modern human handlers, environmental DNA from millennia in soil and cave sediment, and the sheer chemical breakdown of genetic material over thousands of years all stand between these skeletons and a usable genome, and early attempts at ancient DNA work throughout the 1990s had produced enough false starts and contaminated results to make many researchers cautious about the entire field's reliability. But the technology is closing that gap faster than the courtroom battles and academic debates are resolving. Somewhere in a Copenhagen laboratory, a team led by a geneticist named Eske Villerslev is refining techniques for extracting and sequencing ancient DNA from exactly this kind of degraded material, developing protocols specifically designed to distinguish genuine ancient genetic signal from modern contamination, work that will soon turn its attention toward the most contested skeleton in North America. Every theory built on skull shape and stone tool typology is, without anyone in the debate quite realizing it yet, about to be tested against something that bone alone was never able to provide, a direct genetic record written into the skeleton itself, waiting only for a method capable of finally reading it accurately. It is worth pausing here to notice how much weight has accumulated on top of a genuinely thin foundation of evidence. 3 separate theories, each supported by researchers with real credentials and real data, each pointing toward a different origin for the earliest Americans, and each built almost entirely on the outward shape of things, the curve of a skull, the angle of a flaked stone edge, rather than on the genetic material that would eventually settle the question with far greater precision. That is not a failure of the researchers involved. It reflects the honest limits of the tools available to them at the time. Comparative morphology and stone tool typology are legitimate scientific methods, capable of generating real insight when used carefully and interpreted with appropriate caution. But they were never designed to answer a question this specific, about ancestry traced across tens of thousands of years and thousands of miles on their own. What changes everything is not a new skeleton and not a new stone tool. It is a shift already underway in laboratories far from any excavation site, where researchers working on ancient DNA are slowly solving the technical problems that had made genetic testing on remains this old so unreliable throughout the 1990s. Problems of contamination, of degraded and fragmented genetic material, of distinguishing a handful of authentic ancient sequences from an overwhelming background of modern DNA introduced by centuries of handling. Solve those problems, and the entire architecture of competing theories built on skull shape and tool typology suddenly has something it never had before, a way to be tested directly, rather than argued indefinitely. None of the researchers arguing these three positions in the early 2000s know exactly when that shift will arrive, or which of their carefully constructed theories it will confirm, and which it will quietly dismantle. Some are confident their interpretation of the skulls or the stone tools will hold up under genetic scrutiny. Others privately suspect the coming DNA evidence may complicate their own published conclusions in ways they are not yet prepared for. That uncertainty, hanging over an entire field at once, is itself part of what makes the years immediately preceding the genetic breakthroughs so tense within academic circles, even if the tension rarely reaches the broader public in the same way the reconstructed faces and popular Solutrean narratives do, which continue circulating largely unchallenged in mainstream coverage of the period. Inside a laboratory in Copenhagen in the early 2010s, a team led by geneticist Eski Villerslev works with a 200 milligram sample taken from a hand bone belonging to the Kennewick skeleton. It is an almost absurdly small amount of material to carry the weight of an 18-year legal and scientific dispute, a fragment you could hold in the crease of your palm and barely notice. Extracted under sterile conditions specifically designed to prevent contamination from modern human DNA, which clings to nearly every surface a skeleton this old has touched since it first came out of the riverbank in 1996. From evidence bags to gloved hands to the surfaces of a courtroom exhibit table, each new point of contact a potential source of confusion for a laboratory trying to isolate genetic material that is genuinely 9,000 years old. The team's approach is methodologically careful in a way the original 1996 cranial assessment never had the tools to be. Rather than comparing skull shape to a handful of reference populations by eye and caliper, the way the original 1996 assessment had been forced to work, they sequence actual genetic material and compare it statistically against genome data from populations around the world, including, critically, DNA voluntarily contributed by the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation, one of the 5 tribes that had spent nearly 2 decades pursuing repatriation through the courts. The researchers work carefully through multiple independent statistical methods rather than relying on a single test, cross-checking their results against genome data from populations across Asia, Europe, Oceania, and the Americas to rule out contamination or coincidental similarity before drawing any conclusions. The results, published in Nature in 2015, do not leave much room for the kind of ambiguity that had defined this case since the beginning. Kennewick Man's genome is more closely related to modern Native American populations than to any other population on Earth, not closer to Polynesians. Not closer to the Ainu of Japan, another population his skull had at times been compared to in earlier cranial studies, not closer to any European population, despite the Caucasoid-like label attached to his skull nearly 2 decades earlier by a forensic anthropologist working with nothing but calipers and a reference collection. The genetic data places him, specifically, in closer relationship to the Colville than to almost any other tested group, with researchers estimating that the ancestral population of the Colville and Kennewick Man's own lineage diverged from a shared ancestor somewhere around 9,200 years ago, a figure derived from the accumulated genetic differences between the 2 lineages measured against a calibrated mutation rate, a method that allows geneticists to estimate divergence times without any. written record of the populations involved. This is the moment where the entire architecture of the original controversy quietly collapses. The skull that had been used for nearly 20 years as legal and scientific grounds to question this man's Native American affiliation turns out to have been misleading the whole time. Not because anyone lied, but because skull shape, on its own, was never as reliable a signal of ancestry as the original 1996 assessment had implicitly assumed it to be. One of Villeslev's collaborators puts it plainly in discussing the findings: morphology is not always a reliable indicator of ancestry. It is a careful, almost understated way of admitting that an entire branch of comparative anthropology had, in this particular case, been asking Bone to answer a question that only Dina could actually settle with real confidence. The team also revisits the original cranial data itself, applying updated statistical methods to the same skull measurements taken years earlier. Their conclusion adds an additional layer of nuance often lost in later retellings of this story. Connecting any single ancient individual skull to a specific modern population based on shape alone would require comparison against many more skeletons from the same ancestral population than were ever available for Kennewick Man. A sample size of one skull, however carefully measured, was never going to be capable of supporting a firm conclusion about population-level ancestry, a limitation inherent to the method itself rather than to any particular researcher's competence or intentions. The reaction within the scientific community is swift, and for a case this contentious, remarkably unified. Researchers who had spent years arguing over cranial measurements now have something considerably harder to dispute. A direct genetic comparison run against genome data from dozens of populations worldwide, using statistical methods that had been tested and refined across an entire generation of ancient Dinar research since the original 1996 discovery. Several of the same researchers who had contributed to the original forensic assessment 2 decades earlier publicly acknowledged the genetic findings, noting that the comparative anthropology methods available in the mid-1990s simply lacked the resolving power that genome sequencing now provides. This is not a case of one group of scientists being proven wrong by malice or incompetence. It is a case of an entire field's evidentiary standard advancing dramatically within a single generation, leaving conclusions drawn under the old standard looking, in hindsight, considerably less certain than they once felt. For the Colville and the other Columbia Basin tribes who had spent 19 years arguing this exact point in courtrooms, hearings, and public statements, the genetic confirmation lands differently. It is described by tribal representatives less as a scientific surprise and more as an overdue validation of something their oral traditions had insisted upon from the very beginning of the case. Jim Boyd, chairman of the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation, tells reporters the news fits exactly with what the tribes had always maintained throughout nearly 2 decades of litigation, that the Ancient One belonged to them, and had never truly been in doubt. Picture the moment a sequencing readout resolves on a lab monitor, columns of genetic markers converting, almost silently, into a percentage of relatedness, the quiet, unglamorous instant in which 19 years of courtroom argument, museum storage, and public speculation get answered by a machine, doing statistical comparison. No gavel required, no expert witness needed to interpret ambiguous measurements for a jury. There is no dramatic reveal in a courtroom, no lawyers standing to object. There is a data file and a paper submitted for peer review, and then, eventually, a headline that most of the people who had followed the original 1996 controversy will read with genuine surprise. The following year, in 2016, a separate team at the University of Chicago, working at the request of the US Army Corps of Engineers, independently verifies the Copenhagen findings using 3 separate lines of evidence, a deliberate step taken specifically because the case had been so contentious for so long that a single research team's conclusions, however rigorous, were not going to be enough to settle it in the eyes of federal officials responsible for the final determination. The Corps formally determines, after reviewing the accumulated genetic and archaeological evidence in full, that Kennewick Man is Native American under the law, clearing the final obstacle to repatriation after nearly 2 decades of litigation, appeals and public dispute. Senator Maria Cantwell of Washington releases a public statement calling the court's 14-page determination a careful, thorough review of the available scientific evidence and a major step toward finally returning the remains to the tribes who had claimed them as their own since the very beginning of the case in 1996. In 2017, 21 years after 2 young men waded into the Columbia River during a hydroplane race, the remains once known publicly as Kennewick Man, and long known privately among the tribes as the Ancient One, are finally returned to the earth in a private ceremony attended by members of the Confederated Tribes and neighbouring bands. The location of the reburial is kept undisclosed at the request of the tribes, a final act of protection for an ancestor who had spent far too long as a subject of public argument rather than private mourning. His bones handled by more scientists, lawyers and journalists over 2 decades than most people encounter in a lifetime. For many of the tribal members who had pursued this case since 1996, the ceremony carries a weight that no scientific paper, however thorough, could fully capture on its own. Some of the original petitioners who first requested repatriation do not live to see this day. Others describe the reburial not as a legal conclusion, but as the correction of a long delay, a return to something that, in their understanding, had never actually been in genuine dispute to begin with. But the resolution of one case does not resolve the underlying puzzle that started this documentary. Kennewick Man's skull, it turns out, does not tell a reliable story about his ancestry on its own. That fact settles his legal status, closing a case that had outlasted 2 decades of litigation and multiple changes in federal administration. It does not explain why his skull looked the way it did in the first place, why Luzia's skull in Brazil shows a similar pattern despite being found on an entirely different continent thousands of miles away, or why Spirit Cave and other early remains across the hemisphere seem to share features that do not resemble later Native American populations, despite genetics now insisting on a shared ancestral line running through all of them. If skull shape is not the reliable ancestry marker everyone assumed it to be for generations of comparative anthropology, something else has to explain why the earliest American faces look so different from the faces that came after them, across 2 continents and thousands of years. And there is another loose thread still hanging from Chapter 4, the Solutrean hypothesis, resting in part on the idea that Clovis technology, one of the oldest and most distinctive toolkits associated with the earliest well-documented Americans, might trace its origins to Ice Age Europe rather than Asia. Kennewick Man's genome answers one question decisively. It says nothing at all about Clovis, about the fluted points found across North America, or about the population that actually made and carried that technology across the continent. For that answer, the story has to travel to a ranch in Montana, to the only confirmed Clovis burial ever found anywhere in the world, and to a child whose bones are about to settle a very different argument entirely, one that has been running in parallel to the Kennewick case for just as long. It is worth noting how differently these 2 resolutions land, even though they emerge from the same broad shift in genetic technology. The Kennewick case resolves an argument that had a courtroom attached to it, a legal statute, a formal process for determination, and a ceremony marking its conclusion. The Solutrean question, when it is finally addressed by genetic evidence, resolves more quietly, inside academic journals rather than federal proceedings, without the same public drama that had surrounded Kennewick Man for 2 decades. But the underlying method is identical in both cases, a direct genome, sequenced carefully from degraded ancient material, settling a question that skull shape and stone tool comparison alone had left unresolved for years. What Copenhagen accomplished for one contested skeleton, a separate team working roughly 1,000 miles to the east, in Montana, was about to accomplish for an entirely different piece of the same broader mystery, using much the same laboratory techniques refined over the preceding several years. Buried beneath a rock ledge is the grave of a young child, no more than 2 years old at death, surrounded by more than 100 stone and bone tools, fluted projectile points, bifaces, and osseous implements coated in red ochre. the pigment associated across many ancient cultures worldwide with ritual burial and ceremonial care for the dead. The site, later named Anzik after the family who owned the land, will turn out to be the only confirmed burial anywhere in the world directly associated with the Clovis culture, the archaeological tradition defined by its distinctive fluted stone points and dated to roughly 13,000 years ago, one of the oldest widely recognised tool-making traditions in North America. The tools found alongside the child are crafted from 10 different types of high-quality stone, sourced from across a wide expanse of the Rockies stretching through what are now 3 separate states, evidence of either long-distance trade networks or considerable personal travel by the group that buried him, and a level of care that speaks to how deeply this child was valued by the people who laid him to rest so long ago. For decades the child's remains, designated Anzik 1, sit at the centre of the same unresolved question hanging over both Kennewick Man and Luzia: who were the people who made these tools, and where exactly did their ancestors originally come from? The Solutrean hypothesis, introduced back in Chapter 4, offers one answer: that Clovis technology might trace back to Ice Age European seafarers rather than to populations arriving from Northeast Asia. The similarities in flint knapping technique between certain European Ice Age tools and Clovis points, particularly the shared use of an unusual overshot flaking method, had kept that idea circulating in some corners of the field for years, even as most researchers remained unconvinced by an explanation that required an extraordinarily difficult transatlantic crossing with no confirmed intermediate archaeological sites anywhere along the proposed route. The Anzik family, who owned the ranch where the discovery occurred, become unlikely stewards of one of the most significant archaeological finds in North American history. Rather than treating the remains as an object of pure scientific curiosity, the family works over the following decades with researchers, and eventually with regional tribes, to ensure the child is treated with appropriate respect throughout the long process of study. When the 2014 genome sequencing project is finally undertaken, it proceeds only after consultation with area tribal representatives, a marked contrast to the adversarial legal battle that had defined the Kennewick case for nearly 2 decades at that point, and a model some researchers later point to as an example of how ancient DINA research involving indigenous remains might proceed more collaboratively in future cases. Sarah Anzik, a member of the family and herself a molecular biologist, becomes directly involved in the genetic research, adding a personal dimension to a discovery that might otherwise have remained purely academic. Her own professional expertise allowing her to participate as a genuine collaborator in the study of a child found on land her own family had owned for generations. The burial itself, once fully documented, reveals details that complicate any simple picture of Clovis life as sparse or marginal. The child was covered in red ochre pigment, likely applied directly to the body or scattered across the burial pit before it was closed, a practice documented across many unrelated ancient cultures worldwide as a marker of ritual significance. The tools buried alongside him were not simple, expedient implements, but carefully crafted pieces made from 10 distinct types of high-quality stone sourced from across a wide swath of the Rocky Mountain region, spanning what are now 3 separate states. Producing or acquiring that range of raw material implies either extensive travel by the group responsible for the burial or participation in trade networks stretching across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain, evidence of a far more mobile and interconnected society than the word Clovis, reduced in popular imagination to a single distinctive arrowhead shape, might otherwise suggest to someone encountering the term for the first time. Before the 2014 genetic study, researchers examining the Anzik assemblage had already noted that at least 3 separate tool caches at the site appeared to represent distinct episodes of deposition, all clustered in the same general location, suggesting the site held ongoing significance to the people who used it rather than serving as a single isolated burial event. This detail matters for understanding Clovis society more broadly. A culture capable of returning repeatedly to mark a particular place as meaningful, over what may have been an extended period, does not fit comfortably into simplified narratives of small, disconnected bands wandering without established territory or memory of place. In 2014, a team publishes the first full genome sequence ever recovered from Anzic 1's remains in the journal Nature. The result answers the Clovis origin question about as directly as a single dataset can answer anything in archaeology. Anzic 1's genome shows clear, direct genetic ancestry to modern Native American populations across the Americas, with particularly strong affinities to indigenous groups in Central and South America, a finding that surprises some researchers who had expected a closer connection to northern populations given the burial's location in Montana. There is no genetic signal connecting this individual, or the culture that buried him with such evident care, to Ice Age European populations of any kind. The Solutrean hypothesis loses the strongest piece of circumstantial support it had been leaning on. Clovis technology, whatever its precise origins within the broader story of the earliest Americans, was made and carried by people whose direct genetic descendants live across the Western Hemisphere today, not by transplanted mariners from across the Atlantic Ocean. This does not mean that every single question about the earliest peopling of the Americas closes at once. Researchers studying pre-Clovis sites, locations with evidence of human activity that appears to predate the Clovis tradition itself, such as certain layers at sites in Texas, Oregon, and elsewhere, continue debating exactly how early humans first arrived and how many distinct cultural traditions developed once they did. Questions the Anzic genome was never designed to settle. Some archaeologists point to stone tool assemblages dated slightly earlier than the classic Clovis horizon, as evidence that people were present in the Americas before the fluted point tradition emerged, a position that remains debated but no longer carries the same weight it once did in supporting a European origin story. Since the Anzic genome has already ruled out that particular explanation for the population that ultimately did produce Clovis technology. What the Anzic genome resolves specifically is narrower and more concrete. Whoever made Clovis points, and whoever buried this particular child in ochre and stone tools 13 millennia ago, was ancestral to Native Americans, not to Europeans. Closing off one of the three competing explanations introduced back in Chapter 4, with a level of certainty skull shape and stone tool comparison alone had never been able to provide. Picture running a finger along the ridge of one of those fluted points, the sharp facets left by a toolmaker's hands more than 12,000 years ago, resting beside the grave of a child whose parents clearly meant for him to be remembered and cared for even in death, his small body wrapped and covered in pigment before the tools that had likely belonged to people who loved him were laid carefully around him. There is nothing abstract about a burial like this. It is one of the most intimate acts a culture can perform, repeated across every human society that has ever existed, and yet this particular act of grief and ritual had spent decades caught in an argument about transatlantic migration routes that had almost nothing to do with the child himself, reduced instead to a data point in a debate about tool typology conducted by researchers who never knew his name and could only guess at the grief his family must have felt. With the Solutrean question narrowed and the Kennewick question resolved, the field has cleared two of the three competing explanations introduced back in Chapter 4. What remains unresolved is the oldest and, in some ways, the strangest piece of the puzzle, Luzia's skull, and the skulls of other early remains across the Americas that continue to look unlike the modern populations descended from the same genetic lineage now confirmed by both the Kennewick and Anzic studies. If Clovis people were ancestral to modern Native Americans, and if Kennewick Man was too, then why do so many of the very earliest well-preserved skeletons, spread across two continents, separated by thousands of miles, share a skull shape that resembles neither Northeast Asia nor the modern indigenous populations of the Americas? The Dina has now spoken twice, and twice it has confirmed a single shared ancestry running through skeletons that look, on the surface, like they shouldn't belong to the same story at all, one recovered from a riverbank in Washington state, and the other from a burial pit in Montana, separated by hundreds of miles and thousands of years of individual history, yet converging on the same deep ancestral root. That contradiction cannot be waved away as an isolated forensic error anymore, the way it might have been dismissed after Kennewick Man alone. It is showing up too consistently, in too many places, across too much time, involving skeletons from entirely different regions, buried by entirely different cultures, thousands of years apart. Something happened to reshape the faces of the earliest Americans after they arrived, and to understand what, the story has to go back to the very land bridge where this entire ancestral population first became genetically distinct from everyone else on Earth, isolated together for generations before any of these individuals were ever born. It is worth pausing on how much distance this single case has closed. 2 decades of speculation about transatlantic Ice Age mariners, built on real but ultimately misleading similarities in stone tool manufacture, are resolved by a single genome extracted from a child's grave in Montana, examined with the consent and involvement of the very family who first found him. That is not a small achievement, scientifically or ethically. It demonstrates that the same genetic methods capable of settling a contentious 19-year legal battle over Kennewick Man's ancestry can also quietly close off a fringe theory that had for years drawn public attention disproportionate to its actual standing within serious archaeology. But closing off the Solutrean hypothesis does not, on its own, explain the deeper pattern connecting Kennewick Man, Anzic I, and Luzia. 2 separate genomes from 2 very different individuals recovered from 2 very different parts of North America, both point back to the same broad ancestral population, the one believed to have crossed from Asia into the Americas sometime during the last Ice Age. That population has to have existed somewhere, at some point, distinct enough from other world populations that its descendants would carry a clearly identifiable genetic signature thousands of years later. Finding that population and understanding how long it existed in isolation before spreading out across 2 entire continents requires leaving the museum drawers and ranch excavations behind entirely and turning instead toward a landscape that barely exists anymore, buried now beneath the waters of the Bering Strait. During the last Ice Age, when global sea levels sat far lower than they do today, a vast stretch of land connected what is now Siberia to Alaska, a region known as Beringia. That is not a narrow bridge in the way the phrase land bridge tends to suggest in casual imagination, but a broad landmass, in places stretching over 1,000 kilometres wide, capable of supporting plant life, animal populations, and, eventually, the small human groups who crossed it over many generations. Most of this territory now lies beneath the Bering Strait and the surrounding continental shelf, inaccessible to standard archaeological excavation, and knowable today mainly through sediment cores, ancient shoreline reconstructions, and genetic modelling built from the DNA of descendants who never set foot there themselves. That genetic modelling has produced one of the more surprising conclusions in the entire story of the peopling of the Americas, a hypothesis known as the Beringian standstill. Working from mitochondrial DNA data, and later confirmed through broader nuclear genome analysis conducted by several independent research groups, researchers found that the ancestral population that would eventually give rise to nearly all Native Americans appears to have remained genetically isolated in Beringia for an extended period, with estimates generally placing this isolation somewhere in the range of 15 to 20, 5,000 years ago, before the population dispersed further into the Americas. The evidence for this isolation comes primarily from the accumulation of distinct genetic mutations found in Native American populations today, but absent from their closest relatives in Asia, mutations that most plausibly arose during a long period when the ancestral group was cut off from other populations, evolving on its own for thousands of years before descendants moved south into warmer, more hospitable territory. Here is why that matters more than it might first appear to. If a single population sat isolated in one region for thousands of years before spreading out, that strongly implies a single founding population for the overwhelming majority of Native American ancestry, rather than several separate, unrelated migrations arriving independently with their own distinct ancestries, each carrying a genetically distinct heritage into the Americas at a different point in time. That is exactly the model the Kennewick and Anzic genome studies both support, and it is worth noting how unlikely this convergence would be if the underlying reality were actually more complicated than a single founding population. Kennewick Man's lineage and the lineage of the Colville tribe diverged from each other only around 9,200 years ago, well after the standstill period would have ended, meaning both trace back to that same isolated founding population. Anzic 1's genome sits within that same broad ancestral framework as well, connected to the deep Native American lineage rather than to any outside source, despite the many thousands of years and thousands of miles separating the two burials from each other. And despite the very different cultural contexts in which each individual was originally laid to rest by the people who mourned them. Picture standing on ground that has not existed above sea level for thousands of years, an imagined landscape of low tundra and ice-locked coastline, home for uncounted generations to a population that left no monuments, no burial mounds. Nothing that archaeology could ever have found on its own, because the ground beneath their feet is now open ocean, swept by strong currents and buried under sediment that has accumulated for millennia. The only reason anyone knows this population existed at all is that its descendants carry its genetic signature inside them, a kind of evidence written in blood rather than stone. Invisible until sequencing technology learned how to read it, decades after the last archaeological survey of the region had already concluded there was likely nothing left to find. No excavation team will ever walk that particular stretch of ground again, and yet its former inhabitants are, in a very real genetic sense, more thoroughly documented today than many populations whose physical remains have been extensively excavated and studied for generations. The Beringian standstill hypothesis was first proposed based on mitochondrial DNA studies published in the mid-2000s, which noticed a distinct pattern in the genetic diversity of Native American populations that did not fit comfortably with a rapid, uninterrupted migration straight across from Siberia into the Americas. If people had simply walked across Beringia and continued directly southward without any pause at all, the genetic diversity accumulated by their descendants would look noticeably different than what researchers were actually observing in the data. Instead, the pattern found in the data suggested a population that grew and diversified in one place for an extended period of time, then expanded rapidly outward afterward, a genetic footprint consistent with a long pause somewhere along the route rather than a single continuous journey. Subsequent research, incorporating nuclear genome data rather than mitochondrial DNA alone, refined and largely supported this picture, while also revealing additional layers of complexity researchers had not fully anticipated from the earlier mitochondrial studies alone. Genomic analysis of individuals from the Upward Sun River site in central Alaska, dated to roughly 11,500 years ago, identified a genetically distinct population that researchers term ancient Beringians, a group that appears to have split off from the ancestors of all other Native Americans sometime around 20,000 years ago or so, consistent with a population that had already begun diversifying while still isolated in the Beringian region itself. This finding adds a layer of nuance to the standstill model. Rather than a single uniform population waiting in place before spreading out all at once, the evidence suggests an isolated founding group that itself began branching internally even before any descendants moved further into the Americas, complicating the picture in a way that later research would need to account for carefully. Researchers studying this period rely on a method sometimes called a molecular clock, comparing the number of genetic differences accumulated between related populations over time and using an estimated mutation rate to calculate roughly how long ago those populations diverged from a shared common ancestor. This approach carries its own inherent uncertainties, and estimates for the length and timing of the standstill period have shifted somewhat over time as methods have improved and additional ancient genomes have become available for direct comparison. What has remained consistent across multiple independent studies, however, is the core finding that a single ancestral population, isolated for a substantial stretch of time, sits at the root of nearly all Native American genetic diversity observed today. Whether in Washington state, Montana, or the highlands of Brazil, 3 points on the map separated by thousands of miles, yet united by the same deep genetic history. This is where the story reaches a genuine turning point, because the genetic evidence now argues for something the skull evidence, all on its own, had never been able to establish essentially all Native American populations, from the Columbia Basin to Montana to the highlands of Brazil, descend from this single Beringian founding population, isolated together for thousands of years before spreading across 2 continents. The old assumption that different skull shapes must indicate different ancestral origins turns out to be built on a mistaken premise. There may only ever have been one true founding lineage behind Kennewick Man, Anzic I, Luzia and the modern tribes descended from all of them, a lineage that took thousands of years to fully spread from a single point of isolation near the Arctic Circle all the way to the southern tip of South America, crossing an entire hemisphere of dramatically varied climates, altitudes, and ecosystems along the way. But confirming a single shared ancestry does not, on its own, explain the specific mystery that opened this documentary. If Luzia, Kennewick Man, and other early remains all trace back to the same isolated Beringian population as every modern Native American nation, why do their skulls look so different from the skulls of the people who came after them? A single origin explains why the DNA connects them. It does not yet explain why their faces don't, and that gap between a confirmed genetic relationship and a visibly different physical appearance is exactly the kind of contradiction this investigation has been built to take seriously rather than explain away, or worse, quietly ignore in the interest of a tidier, more comfortable narrative than the evidence actually supports. That gap between shared ancestry and different appearance is not a flaw in the genetic story, it is the next clue. Somewhere between the standstill in Beringia and the modern populations living across the Americas today, something reshaped the physical appearance of these founding lineages, gradually, generation after generation, without ever breaking the genetic thread that ties them all together. The evidence suggests this did not happen through a second migration, or a Solutrean detour, or any outside population at all. It happened after arrival, inside the Americas themselves, in a way that would take one more genetic study, sequencing the skeletons most central to this entire mystery, to finally demonstrate with real clarity. It is worth sitting with the strangeness of that conclusion for a moment. A single group of people, isolated on a landmass that no longer exists, spent thousands of years developing into the ancestral population behind every individual featured so far in this investigation. The man from the Columbia River, the child from the Montana ranch, and the woman from the Brazilian cave, along with the hundreds of indigenous nations living across 2 continents today. That isolation left a genetic signature durable enough to survive 15,000 years, multiple migrations across an entire hemisphere, and centuries of subsequent history, still legible to researchers working with modern sequencing technology. What it did not leave behind, at least not in any simple or uniform way, was a fixed physical appearance. The population that eventually became genetically identifiable as the root of nearly all Native American ancestry did not necessarily look, in any particular generation, like the descendants it would eventually produce thousands of years and thousands of miles later. This is precisely the kind of finding that resists a tidy single-sentence summary, and that resistance is itself part of the point. Genetics can trace ancestry with remarkable precision, identifying shared origin points separated by tens of thousands of years and enormous geographic distances. But genetics, on its own, does not explain why a population's outward appearance shifts over time. Only that ancestry and appearance are 2 separate threads that do not necessarily move in lockstep with each other. Untangling exactly how and why the earliest American faces changed as thoroughly as they did required a different kind of study, one focused specifically on comparing genetically related individuals separated by thousands of years, to see directly whether their appearance evolved even as their underlying ancestry stayed continuous, and if so, by what mechanism such a dramatic physical transformation could occur without ever introducing a genetically distinct population into the story. That study would eventually take shape not in Montana or Washington state, but back where this particular thread of the mystery first began, in the same limestone hills of Lagoa Santa, where Luzia herself had been resting for 11,500 years, waiting for a genetic method precise enough to finally place her, definitively, on the same family tree as everyone who came after her. In 2018, a research team led by geneticist J. Victor Moreno-Mayer sequences the genomes of several additional early skeletons recovered from the Lagoa Santa region of Brazil, the same limestone landscape where Luzia herself was discovered decades earlier, and closely related in time and geography to her original burial context. The question driving the study is direct and long overdue. If Luzia's skull looks so different from later Native American populations, does her genome show the same kind of difference, the way Neves's two-wave Paleo-American model had proposed it should? Or does it tell an entirely different story than the one her cranium alone had suggested for so many decades? The results, published in Science, do not support a second, separate migration. Genetically, these Paleo-American-looking individuals from the Lagoa Santa region fall within the same broad Native American lineage as everyone else studied throughout this documentary so far, the same founding population traced back through Kennewick Man, through Anzic I, and ultimately back to the Beringian standstill population itself. There is no distinct second ancestry hiding behind Luzia's unusual skull shape, contrary to what decades of cranial analysis had seemed to suggest. Genetically, she belongs to the same family tree as the modern indigenous populations, whose faces look nothing like the reconstruction built from her bones and displayed for decades in the National Museum in Rio de Janeiro. The Lagoa Santa samples used in the 2018 study present their own significant and considerable technical challenges. Ancient Dina degrades faster in tropical and subtropical environments than in the cold, dry conditions that had helped preserve genetic material in remains like Anzic I in Montana, or, to a lesser degree, Kennewick Man in the arid Pacific Northwest. Extracting usable genetic sequences from skeletons that had spent over 10,000 years in the humid limestone caves of central Brazil requires laboratory protocols specifically refined for working with badly degraded material. Techniques that had matured considerably in the years since the original Kennewick and Anzic studies were first published in the mid-2010s. The success of the Lagoa Santa sequencing project depends directly on that accumulated technical progress, arriving at a moment in the history of the field when ancient Dina methods had finally advanced enough to tackle samples that would have been considered essentially unworkable only a decade earlier. The research team does not limit its analysis to a single individual alone. By sequencing multiple skeletons from the same broad region and comparing their genetic profiles against a wide range of ancient and modern populations across the Americas, Asia and Oceania, the study is able to test the two-wave Paleo-American hypothesis directly, rather than relying on skull measurements as a proxy for ancestry, the way earlier researchers had been forced to for lack of any better available method. If Neves's model were correct, these Paleo-American-looking individuals should show genetic ancestry distinct from later Native American populations, tracing back clearly to an entirely separate founding migration event from somewhere else. Instead, the genetic data places them squarely within the same broad ancestral lineage as every other Native American population tested, without exception. This outcome does not sit comfortably with everyone in the field, at least not immediately upon publication. Neves's two-wave model had shaped textbooks, museum exhibits, and popular science coverage for well over a decade by the time the 2018 study is published, and overturning an interpretation with much institutional and public investment behind it takes considerably more than a single paper, however methodologically rigorous that paper might be. Some researchers who had worked closely with the Paleo-American framework for years express initial skepticism, questioning whether the specific skeletons sampled for genetic analysis were fully representative of the broader pattern Neves had originally described across multiple different excavation sites. Subsequent studies, incorporating additional samples and refined statistical methods over the following several years, largely reinforced the 2018 conclusions, gradually shifting scientific consensus toward the local evolution explanation, though pockets of debate about the precise mechanisms involved persist within specialized academic circles even today. The paper's conclusion reframes nearly 2 decades of debate in a single sentence the differences between Paleo-American individuals and later Native American populations most likely resulted from local evolution after settlement, not from separate ancestral origins. In plain terms, this means that appearance itself is not the fixed, unchanging inheritance many people instinctively assume it to be. A population can remain genetically continuous, unbroken, directly descended from the same ancestors, while its physical appearance visibly changes over the course of thousands of years, shaped by local environment, genetic drift within a limited population. And the ordinary churn of biological variation acting on a small founding group spread thin across 2 continents over an extended period of time. To understand how a change this dramatic could occur without any new population ever entering the story, it helps to consider the scale involved. A small founding population, numbering perhaps only in the low thousands based on genetic diversity estimates drawn from modern and ancient samples alike, spread out gradually across 2 entire continents, from the Arctic Circle all the way down to the southern tip of South America, over the course of many thousands of years and countless individual generations. Small, relatively isolated groups, separated from one another by enormous distances and by geographic barriers ranging from mountain ranges to dense rainforest, are exactly the conditions under which genetic drift, essentially random shifts in the frequency of particular traits from one generation to the next, can produce noticeable changes in average appearance relatively quickly on an evolutionary timescale. Add in genuine adaptive pressure from different climates, different available diets, and different disease environments encountered across such a wide range of new territory, and the outcome is a population that can look substantially different from its own direct ancestors within a few thousand years, even without a single outside genetic contribution to its overall makeup. This is not a dismissal of Neves's original observations. His measurements of Lucia's skull were accurate. Her cranium really is shaped differently from later Native American populations in the same region, a fact confirmed rather than contradicted by the newer genetic study. What the 2018 genetic study reinterprets is not the measurement itself, but the explanation behind it. Neves had proposed that a second migratory wave explained the difference. The genome says otherwise. The difference emerged after a single population had already settled into the Americas, not before 2 separate populations arrived from different points of origin. In a sense, both researchers were right about the part of the puzzle their methods were actually capable of measuring. Neves correctly identified a real, measurable pattern in cranial shape, and the geneticists correctly identified a single, unbroken line of ancestry beneath that pattern. The disagreement was never really about the data itself, but about which explanation that data could support. Picture 2 skull casts placed side by side on a laboratory bench, calipers resting between them, morphology charts spread out showing measurable differences in cranial length, facial projection and jaw structure, and now knowing, thanks to sequencing technology that did not exist when either skull was first excavated, that both skulls, different as they look, sit on the very same branch of the same family tree. That is a strange thing to hold in your mind at once. A face can change enough, across enough generations, in enough physical isolation, to look almost unrecognizable next to its own descendants, without a single new population ever entering the story at any point along the way, and without the underlying bloodline ever actually breaking. This finding closes the central mystery that opened this documentary, at least in its broadest outline. The reason the earliest well-preserved skulls in the Americas look so different from later Native American populations is not that they came from somewhere else entirely. It is that a single founding population, isolated for thousands of years in Beringia and then spread thin across 2 entire continents, kept evolving physically after it arrived, shaped by climate, by diet, by genetic drift acting on small, scattered groups, by all the ordinary evolutionary pressures that reshape any population given enough time and enough isolation from other groups over enough generations. Appearance changed. Ancestry did not. But one thread from earlier in this investigation has not yet been fully accounted for. Back in Chapter 3, the synodonty and sundodonty dental research pioneered by Christy Turner offered another line of evidence for tracing Native American ancestry to a Northeast Asian homeland, based on distinctive tooth crown and root patterns distinguishing Northeast Asian and Native American populations from the different dental patterns found across Southeast Asia. Turner's original research, spanning decades of careful cataloguing across thousands of individual teeth from populations worldwide, had identified this pattern as a reliable marker of deep population history, one that broadly supports the single origin model now confirmed through genetic sequencing. But dental morphology, like cranial morphology before it, carries its own methodological complications. A 2015 reanalysis conducted by Stojanovsky and colleagues found significant inter-observer error in some of the original dental scoring methods, meaning different researchers examining the same teeth did not always record the same measurements, introducing a degree of uncertainty into results that had previously been treated as more definitive than the underlying data may have actually supported. That reanalysis does not overturn the broader synodonty and sundodonty pattern, but it does serve as a reminder that even supporting evidence deserves the same scrutiny applied to skull shape decades earlier. The physical record across bone and tooth alike has to be read carefully and rechecked before its conclusions can be trusted completely, no matter how intuitive the underlying pattern might initially appear to a researcher working with limited comparative data. And there is a second, separate loose thread, one that genetics itself introduced rather than resolved. Deep in the Amazon rainforest, among populations whose ancestors also trace back to that same Beringian founding lineage, researchers have found something in the DNA that does not fit neatly into the single origin story this chapter has just confirmed. That signal, first identified only a few years before the Lagoa Santa study, remains one of the genuinely unresolved questions in the entire field, one that no amount of local evolution explanation has yet been able to fully account for. It is worth pausing here to appreciate the scale of the reversal this chapter represents within the broader arc of this documentary as a whole. What began as a single unusual skull pulled from a Washington riverbank in 1996 has, over the course of more than 2 decades and multiple independent genetic studies, been transformed into strong evidence for exactly the opposite of what that skull initially seemed to suggest to the forensic anthropologist who first examined it. Rather than pointing toward multiple separate ancestral populations arriving in the Americas at different times from different geographic origins, the accumulated evidence across Kennewick Man, Anzic I, and now the Lagoa Santa skeletons all converges on a single deep ancestral root, isolated together in Beringia for thousands of years before spreading across 2 continents, and slowly, unevenly, reshaping itself along the way as it encountered new environments. The mystery that opened this investigation now has a real, well-supported answer, grounded in independent genetic evidence gathered across 2 continents and multiple research teams working entirely separately from one another. But as with most genuinely honest answers in science, it does not close every door behind it. Researchers working with indigenous Amazonian populations, including the Suru and Caritiana peoples of Brazil, collect genetic samples as part of broader efforts to map Native American ancestry in greater detail than earlier, more geographically limited studies had managed to achieve. The work involves ordinary field conditions rarely glamorized in documentaries about ancient Dina. Vials carried through humid forest, samples logged and refrigerated in remote field stations running on generator power, genetic material eventually shipped out for sequencing in laboratories thousands of miles away in the United States and Europe. These are not ancient remains excavated from a burial site, but living communities whose members volunteer their own Dina to help researchers understand the deep history that connects them to the broader story of the Americas. What comes back from that sequencing, published separately by 2 research teams in 2015, one led by geneticist Pontus Skoglund in Nature, another by Marnasa Raghavan in Science, is a faint but statistically detectable genetic signal connecting certain Amazonian populations to Australasian populations, including groups in Papua New Guinea and among indigenous Australians living thousands of miles across the Pacific Ocean. This is not the same kind of signal that defined the earlier Paleo-American skull debate. It is not a difference in bone shape open to competing forensic interpretation. It is a measurable genetic affinity, small in magnitude but consistent enough across multiple Amazonian groups to require an explanation, showing up in statistical tests specifically designed to detect subtle traces of shared ancestry between populations that would otherwise appear unrelated. By this point in the story, the standard explanation should feel almost automatic to anyone who has followed the earlier chapters closely. Everyone traces back to a single Beringian founding population. Appearance simply diverged afterward through local evolution. Case closed. This new signal does not fit comfortably inside that explanation. An Australasian genetic affinity, appearing specifically in certain Amazonian populations and largely absent elsewhere in the Americas, suggests either a deeper, more complicated population structure within the original founding group than anyone had modelled, or possibly a distinct minor migration event separate from the main Beringian lineage, contributing a small genetic trace to some populations but not others across an otherwise unified genetic landscape. To understand why this signal is so difficult to explain away, it helps to walk through exactly what the statistical tests involved are actually measuring. Researchers use methods that compare patterns of shared genetic variance across many different populations simultaneously, looking for statistical evidence that one population shares more genetic material with a particular reference group than would be expected by chance alone, given everything already known about how these populations are related to each other through the standard single. Migration model. When Skoglund's team ran these tests on the Suru and Caritiana, along with several other Amazonian groups, the results consistently showed a small but statistically significant excess of shared genetic variation with Australasian populations, a pattern that did not appear in the same way among Native American populations from North America or from other parts of South America outside the Amazon basin. This geographic specificity is part of what makes the signal so genuinely puzzling to researchers examining it closely. If the Australasian affinity reflected some kind of broad, ancient connection present throughout the entire founding population before it dispersed from Beringia, researchers would expect to see traces of it more evenly distributed across Native American populations continent-wide, from the Arctic to Tierra del Fuego. Instead, it appears concentrated specifically in certain Amazonian groups. While remaining essentially undetectable in populations from Central America, the Andes, or North America more broadly, a distribution pattern that resists a single simple explanation and has kept researchers debating the underlying cause for close to a decade now. Manasa Raghavan's independently conducted study, published the same year, reaches broadly similar conclusions using a different set of ancient and modern genomes, adding an important layer of confirmation that the signal is not simply a statistical artifact produced by one particular research team's specific choice of methods or reference samples. Two separate groups of researchers, working somewhat independently of each other and publishing in two different major scientific journals within months of one another, converging on the same basic finding, lends the population-Y signal a credibility that a single isolated study would not carry on its own, even as the two teams continue to differ somewhat in how they interpret what the signal ultimately means for the broader history of the Americas. Researchers have proposed a working label for whatever ancestral source produced this signal, population Y, an acknowledgement that its precise identity and origin remain unresolved even a decade after the original studies were published. Some researchers argue the signal reflects genuine ancient population substructure, evidence that the founding population crossing into the Americas was never as genetically uniform as the standstill model assumes, carrying within it distinct sublineages that later separated unevenly across different regions of the continent, as different groups spread out from Beringia along different routes and settled in different areas. Under this interpretation, the Australasian-related ancestry could have been present in some diluted form within the broader founding population all along, only becoming statistically detectable in certain populations today because of how genetic drift and later population bottlenecks concentrated or diluted that ancestral signal unevenly as different groups settled different parts of the hemisphere over thousands of years. Others argue the pattern can be explained without invoking any separate migration at all, attributing it instead to genetic drift, small founding population sizes, and the statistical noise that can appear when tracing faint ancestral signals across populations separated by thousands of years and enormous geographic distances, particularly when working with the specific set of reference populations available to researchers at the time. Under this competing interpretation, the appearance of an Australasian affinity might reflect deep, shared ancestry connecting all of humanity's out of African migrations at some point tens of thousands of years earlier. A connection that could resurface statistically in small, isolated populations through ordinary genetic drift without requiring any specific migration event connecting Australasia directly to the Amazon at any point in more recent history. A subsequent study published by Castro e Silva and colleagues in the years following the original 2015 papers offers additional analysis supporting the drift-based explanation, arguing that the signal can be reproduced under models that do not require a distinct population Y migration at all, once certain statistical assumptions about population size and history are adjusted. This does not settle the matter definitively. However, other researchers continue to find the substructure explanation more persuasive, particularly given how specifically the signal appears concentrated in certain Amazonian groups rather than distributed more broadly, a pattern some argue is difficult to fully explain through drift alone without invoking at least some deeper structure within the original founding population. The question remains genuinely unsettled. This is not a case where caution is being manufactured for dramatic effect within this documentary. Researchers actively publishing on this topic genuinely disagree about what the population Y signal represents, and no single study since 2015 has definitively closed the debate one way or the other, despite continued interest and additional sampling efforts across the region in the years since. The field research underlying these genetic studies also deserves its own attention, separate from the statistical debate it eventually produced. Sampling DNA from remote Amazonian communities requires researchers to work directly and respectfully with community leaders and individual participants, explaining the purpose of the research, obtaining informed consent for genetic testing, and often returning years later with results and further questions as new statistical methods become available. This kind of ongoing collaboration differs considerably from the extraction of DNA from long-dead skeletal remains discussed throughout earlier chapters of this investigation, since living participants can ask questions, decline participation entirely, and engage directly with what the resulting research eventually concludes about their own deep ancestry, a relationship that carries its own distinct ethical considerations, quite different from those surrounding the study of ancient skeletal remains discussed elsewhere in this documentary. Picture watching a genetic analysis chart resolve on a screen, expecting a clean confirmation of a story that had by this point already been told and retold across 2 continents and thousands of years, and instead finding a small, stubborn signal sitting exactly where it should not be, according to every model built so far. That is the particular unease this kind of discovery produces, not the shock of something being completely wrong, but the quieter, more uncomfortable realization that even a well-supported answer might still be missing a piece, however small that piece might turn out to be in the final accounting. What makes this moment matter for the larger story is not that it undoes anything already confirmed in earlier chapters of this documentary. Kennewick Man's ancestry is settled. Anzac One's connection to modern Native Americans is settled. The Beringian standstill model and the explanation for why Luzia's skull looks so different from later populations are both well supported by multiple independent genetic studies conducted by entirely different research groups, working with different sets of samples and using somewhat different statistical methods. What the population Y signal demonstrates instead is that even after solving the central mystery this documentary opened with, the deepest layer of this entire story, the very earliest population structure among the ancestors of all Native Americans, still has questions nobody has fully answered, even with all the sophisticated genetic tools currently available to researchers working on this problem today. That is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is easy, watching a story move from contradiction to resolution across 8 chapters, to expect a clean, final answer waiting at the end. Sometimes the honest ending is not a closed door. Sometimes it is a door still slightly open, with researchers continuing to study exactly this question in populations across the Amazon today, using techniques that keep improving year over year as sequencing technology becomes cheaper and more precise. The story of the earliest Americans has resolved one enormous contradiction. It has also quietly revealed a smaller one, buried inside the same evidence, that nobody yet knows how to fully close, and that may not be closed for years to come, if it is ever fully closed at all. There is something fitting about ending this particular chapter on a note of genuine uncertainty rather than manufactured suspense. Every earlier resolution in this investigation, Kennewick Man's ancestry, the Solutrean hypothesis, the true explanation behind Luzia's unusual skull, arrived only after researchers were willing to sit with an unresolved contradiction for years, sometimes decades, resisting the temptation to settle on a comfortable answer before the evidence actually supported one. The population Y signal is, in that sense, simply the newest chapter in a much older pattern within this entire field. Physical or genetic evidence surfaces that does not fit the prevailing model, researchers argue over what it means, and eventually, sometimes only after considerable additional data and years of careful work, a clearer picture begins to emerge. Whether that clearer picture, when it eventually arrives for population Y at some point in the coming years, will confirm ancient population substructure, statistical drift, or some combination of both factors remains to be seen. And honest researchers on every side of the current debate readily admit as much. In 2017, members of the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation and neighbouring Columbia Basin tribes gather along a quiet stretch of the Columbia River for a private ceremony, one that most of the world will never learn the exact details of. The exact location is kept undisclosed out of respect for tribal wishes, but it sits somewhere along the same waterway where 21 years earlier, 2 young men waded into the shallows during a hydroplane race and found a human skull surfacing from the mud. This time there is no forensic team, no evidence bags, no courtroom waiting somewhere downstream. There is only the return of a set of remains, once called Kennewick Man by the public, and the ancient one by the tribes who fought for nearly 2 decades to bring him home, finally laid back into the earth he had been taken from. It is worth tracing the full distance this story has travelled to arrive at that quiet ceremony. It began with a skull shape described in 1996 as Caucasoid-like, treated for years afterward as though it were reliable evidence of who this man's ancestors were. It moved through a federal legal battle that lasted almost as long as some of the people fighting it had been alive, resting on the assumption that appearance could stand in for ancestry when written or genetic records could not reach far enough back to answer the question directly. It widened into a continental mystery when Luzia's skull in Brazil revealed the same basic contradiction thousands of miles away and thousands of years apart, in a completely different cultural and legal context. It generated real, serious competing theories, a second migration, a possible Ice Age European contribution, each one built on the same underlying assumption that had shaped the original Kennewick controversy, that the shape of bone and stone could substitute for the evidence hidden inside cells, waiting patiently for a method capable of reading it. Genetics eventually answered what bone alone never could. Kennewick Man's genome placed him closer to modern Native Americans, and specifically to the Colville people themselves, than to any other population on Earth. ANZIC 1's genome tied Clovis technology directly and unambiguously to Native American ancestry, closing off the Solutrean explanation that had circulated for years on the strength of tool similarities alone, without any genetic evidence to actually support it. And the 2018 study of Luzia's relatives in Lagoa Santa demonstrated conclusively that her strange, unfamiliar skull shape did not represent a separate ancestral population at all, but the same single Beringian lineage, reshaped by thousands of years of local evolution after arrival, rather than by a second wave of migration from somewhere else entirely. That is not a small correction to make to nearly 2 decades of scientific and legal argument. The assumption running underneath the entire Kennewick case, and underneath Neves's original interpretation of Luzia, was that appearance is a direct, readable signature of ancestry, that if a skull looks unfamiliar, it must belong to an unfamiliar bloodline. The genetic evidence gathered across this documentary says the opposite. A single founding population, isolated together in Beringia for thousands of years, spread out across 2 entire continents, and kept changing physically long after its genetic story had already been written into its cells. The faces of the earliest Americans do not resemble the faces of their own descendants, and the bloodline connecting them never broke once across that entire span of time. For many of the people who spent parts of their lives on either side of the original Kennewick dispute, the 2017 ceremony carries a weight that goes beyond the resolution of a single legal case. Some of the original tribal petitioners who first requested repatriation in 1996 did not live to see this moment. Some of the scientists who fought to continue studying the remains had, by 2017, spent the better part of their careers connected in some way to this one set of bones. The ceremony itself, deliberately kept private and undisclosed, stands in sharp contrast to nearly every other moment in this story, which played out for over 2 decades under the glare of national media attention, courtroom transcripts, and public argument. After 21 years of being examined, measured, litigated, and discussed by strangers, the Ancient One is finally returned to the ground quietly, among people who already understood, long before any laboratory confirmed it, exactly who he was. It is worth pausing here to consider what this particular case demonstrates about the limits of the evidence available to any given generation of researchers working within the constraints of their own historical moment. In 1996, cranial morphology represented the most direct physical evidence available for assessing ancestry from skeletal remains, and applying it here was neither malicious nor unreasonable given the tools of the time. The problem was never that anyone acted in bad faith. The problem was that an entire body of evidence, treated for generations as sufficient to answer questions about deep ancestry, turned out to have limits nobody had fully tested, until a case this consequential forced the question. Kennewick Man's 21-year journey from riverbank to reburial stands as a kind of case study in how scientific consensus should ideally work, not through stubborn attachment to an initial interpretation, but through a willingness to update conclusions once better evidence becomes available, however uncomfortable that update might be for those who had built careers, court cases, and public reputations around the earlier picture. The broader story this documentary has followed does not belong to Kennewick Man alone, of course. It belongs equally to Anzac I, the Clovis child from Montana whose burial finally settled, decisively, a debate about transatlantic Ice Age migration that had circulated in popular science coverage for years despite lacking serious support within mainstream archaeology. It belongs to Luzia, resting for over 4 decades in Brazilian museum collections before fire destroyed her physical remains, her genetic legacy preserved instead through careful prior scanning and through the DNA of her Lagoa Santa contemporaries, whose genomes ultimately settled the question her skull alone could never answer on its own. And it belongs, in its most unresolved form, to the Suru and Kuritiana peoples of the Amazon, whose living DNA carries a signal that continues to complicate even the most careful, most thoroughly supported conclusions this field of research has managed to produce. That single conclusion also explains something broader than any one skeleton. The extraordinary physical diversity found among Native American populations today, from the Arctic to Tierra del Fuego, reflects thousands of years of local adaptation acting on one shared ancestral population, not evidence of separate racial origins or separate arrivals scattered across the continent by chance. Diversity in appearance, in this specific and well-documented case, turns out to be a record of time and place, not of separate ancestry. A distinction that matters far beyond the narrow academic debate that first brought it to light. And yet the story this documentary has followed does not end in full, tidy certainty, because certainty was never really available anywhere along this path, and pretending otherwise now would betray everything this investigation has tried to demonstrate about how real evidence actually works. The population Y signal, discovered deep in the Amazon and still debated by researchers today, remains a genuinely open question, a faint echo inside the genome of certain indigenous populations that the single origin model, however well supported, has not yet fully explained. Some researchers see it as evidence of ancient population structure nobody has mapped yet. Others see it as statistical noise inside a story that is otherwise settled. Nobody currently studying this question claims to have the final answer, and the honest ones say so plainly. Picture standing at the edge of the Columbia River today, at the undisclosed stretch where the ancient one now rests, water moving the same way it moved in 1996, the same way it likely moved 500 years ago when this man was still alive along its banks. The ground looks ordinary, it always does, after a mystery this large gets partially resolved. But somewhere beneath that quiet current sits a river's worth of contradictions that took 2 continents, 3 competing theories, and 3 separate genome studies to even begin to untangle, and somewhere in the Amazon, a much smaller, much stranger signal is still waiting for its own answer, one no lawsuit and no reburial ceremony can ever fully close. We know more today about who the earliest Americans were than we did in 1996, or in 1975, or in 1968. We know their faces changed more than their ancestry ever did. We know a courtroom spent nearly 2 decades arguing about a question that a 200 milligram sample of bone eventually settled in a matter of months. But the past, even now, has not finished telling this particular story. Consider for a moment how differently this entire investigation might have concluded had it stopped at any earlier point along the way. If it had stopped after the original 1996 cranial assessment, the story would have ended with a false impression of Kennewick Man as somehow disconnected from Native American ancestry, an impression that shaped nearly 2 decades of legal argument before genetics corrected it. If it had stopped after Nevis's original Paleo-American model, the story would have ended with a second, separate migration wave that the 2018 Lagoa Santa genomes ultimately showed never actually happened. If it had stopped immediately after the 2018 study confirmed the single origin, local evolution explanation, the story would have missed the population Y signal entirely, presenting a tidier, more complete feeling conclusion than the evidence, taken as a whole, actually supports. Each apparent ending in this investigation turned out to be only a waypoint, and there is no particular reason to assume the current understanding represents the final one either. That is, in its own particular way, the most honest note this kind of documentary can possibly end on. Science, done carefully and done well, rarely produces the kind of clean, permanent closure that popular storytelling often demands of it. It produces instead a series of increasingly refined pictures, each one closer to the truth than the last, each one still fully open to revision by the next generation of researchers working with better tools, larger sample sizes, and questions the current generation has not yet even thought to ask. Kennewick Man's story took 21 long years to reach even its partial resolution. From the summer afternoon the bones first surfaced to the quiet ceremony that finally returned them to the ground, the population Y question has already run for a decade, with no clear end in sight to the debate among the researchers still actively working on it. There is no particular reason to expect the next chapter of this specific mystery, whenever it eventually arrives, to move along any faster than the ones that came before it. If this investigation into how appearance, ancestry, and the deep past collide left you with more questions than you expected, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. It always means something to see how far a story like this one travels, and how many different corners of the world end up connected by the same 9,000-year-old riddle. And if you want to keep following investigations like this, following the evidence wherever it actually leads, even when that evidence refuses to arrive at a tidy conclusion, subscribe and stay close to the river.